All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alison Snyder. I'm a managing editor at Axios. I cover science, oddly enough, and also oversee our world news team. So I'm really excited to be here today to talk with this group about tech power and cooperation. Let's see. So I think the overview of the session is sort of given the sort of game-changing characteristics of a lot of these technologies, like AI, quantum computing, which is not quite here yet, and biotechnology for sort of the power relations among nations, and between technological actors. The sort of big question is what can be done to sort of come up with cooperative arrangements to come up and safeguard the human good and sort of keep humans at the center of all this. And so we have a great panel to talk about this. Directly next to me is the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Digital Transformation for Ukraine, Mykhailo Fedorov.
Hello, Raul.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Next to him is Kent Walker. He's the President of Global Affairs and the Chief Legal Officer at Google. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Alison.
Next to him, Brett Solomon, who's the co-founder and executive director of Access Now, which she will tell us a little bit more about your work. And then on the end is Genevieve Bell. She is a distinguished professor and the director of the School of Cybernetics at the Australian National University. So that's the Australian end of the stage there. Watch out. So thank you again, all of you, for being here. And my first question is to you, Deputy Prime Minister, and that is, I think if we take half of this conversation about tech power, one of the consequences of power is that there become asymmetries. In this case, we're talking about digital asymmetries. What are you seeing right now in Ukraine? How do you see that playing out? What are the asymmetries that you're dealing with?
Да, всім доброго дня.
Yes, hello. Good day to everyone. I think technologies today are a very important component of the war that's going on. And technologies helped us, as a matter of fact, to keep the economy going. Because Ukraine is a rather digital state. Over the last 3 years, we've made a huge jump forward. And all our system of social payments, customs, taxes, this state is based on the information system and exchange of information between these information systems. And therefore, for us, it's a maximum critically important to keep the system going and working. And the system kept working despite the fact the cyber war was underway at the same time. And I can tell you, almost every week we launch new digital products in Ukraine. We have communications, we have a plan what to do with the communication if there's a blackout, if there's no electricity in the regions or the capital in the country, 15 hours without electricity, how we're deploying satellite communication, how we're opening breakability centers where people can connect to the internet. So technologies for us are of critical importance for us. We managed to build a foundation that allows us to keep the digital state going and working. And I think that we will face new technological breakthrough in this year. The war is a technological war. The impact of technologies and role of technologies is growing. Before I entered this panel discussion, I saw how a surgery was performed on an oncological patient in Ukraine. A lot of doctors joined in online and watched this surgery. And that's an important role. And at the same moment, a missile could be flying by. It could be electricity could be switched off. Mobile towers could be switched off. We know exactly what to do about that at that particular moment, how to switch it. So to sum it all up, technologies are extremely important during the war. They help to make sure the economy keeps going. In our country, they allow us to stay in touch, exchange information, make quick decisions. Technologies help save people's lives. Technologies help our armed forces to communicate with each other through the satellite communication. And yesterday, we had a historic day for the digital state. Estonia actually took the code of our product, took our UX, UI approach and implemented it in their own e-application for state country. Let me remind you, Estonia is one of the most digitized digitized countries in Europe and the world. They took the Ukrainian experience, though, and implemented it in Estonia, while Ukraine developed it, continued doing it during the war. Owing to the technologies, a lot has been done, and therefore we're here, and therefore we're aiming to develop Ukraine further technologically.
Back to how you're cooperating with other countries. The idea of a technological breakthrough during a war is fascinating. I was just hanging on what you said there. But Kent, I guess the question for you, how are you how do you see big tech's role in particularly how you've been working with Ukraine, but also just sort of more broadly, what has gone right and where has it gone wrong?
Let me start by complimenting the minister's investment in digital technology, which I agree has been so important to the lives of people in Ukraine now and going forward as we work on the reconstruction. The world, I think, to step back, is at two simultaneous inflection points, one in the world of technology and the other in the world of geopolitics and the fragmentation that the theme of the conference talks about. We are seeing astonishing things in technology. We have moved from being able to have tools that connect people in a dozen different languages to now 1,000 different languages. Some of the AI work you see, if we talk about the AI is just a super chatbot, we are seriously misunderestimating the potential of this technology. Technology is gradually, we think of it as a gradual up and to the right. This is not that. This is a step change. This is the new changes we're seeing in AI are some of the biggest innovations that computer scientists have seen in their entire lives. And this will open up incredible possibilities. And in healthcare, the sorts of examples the minister was giving, but also diagnosis. Imagine a new green revolution, precision agriculture around the world, clean water. The potential is incredible. But at the same time, the second inflection point with regard to fragmentation and division in the world creates new challenges for us, because these same tools and their amazing power can be used for bad by nation states, rogue actors, cyber criminals. We need to come together more than ever before to make sure we have codes and agreements. I go back to the Asilomar conference around genetic research back in California decades ago. We need that same sort of thing for artificial intelligence to make sure we are taking advantage of this potential age of abundance that's in front of us and minimizing the misuse and the threats.
Brett, we're talking about one of the unintended consequences here is that these sort of disproportionately help to strengthen the positions of those in power, and sort of drive a bigger wedge between people, let's say, parties that are well off and marginalized populations. So I guess, how do you determine if or when a technology is being too seriously abused or even misused, that it's to remain viable? How does
Yeah. Thanks very much. And I think it is important to recognise that, still a third of the world's population is offline. So when we think about asymmetry, there's a whole group, billions of people who haven't even entered into the digital environment. And yet here we're also, we're talking about generative AI and we're talking about quantum. Before we've even conquered the digital divide, we're now needing to deal with, the quantum divide. And so the consequences for the marginalised and the dispossessed and the poor, there's a gender divide as well, of course, that we need to take into account. We generally use the International Human Rights Framework as the basis upon deciding the benefits and also the dangers of technology. And I think that one of the great things about the Human Rights Framework is that it has precedent, it has a legal framework, it's actually law, and there are bodies with which we can, sanction and put some teeth behind that. Much better than ethics. There's a whole, explosion of the use of ethics within companies and also within governments, which is very subjective and also value-laden. And I think Human Rights Framework is a much better way in which to determine the benefits and the dangers of human rights, of technologies. But I would point to, spyware as an example of where technology has gone completely out of control. The consequences of spyware for everybody, I kind of think of it like weed killer. It destroys everything before it. And that's why we as an organisation have called for a moratorium on the sale, the use and the export of spyware. I think also when we think about surveillance, particularly biometric surveillance in public spaces, we've called for a ban on that. There is no human rights way in which we could justify using facial recognition in public spaces to identify people. Because the end point of that, of course, is the authoritarian state, and we don't want technology to be the tool for that.
Genevieve, I'm curious, thinking about all of this, whose job is it? Whose job is it to anticipate what's going to happen with these new technologies? And is it the innovator, the user, the regulator, the legal framework? I think we've decided not the ethicist.
Well, but I think it's yes, all of the above and. So I mean, I think one of the things that's really striking, you sort of want to take a step back and say, we're having a conversation right now about artificial intelligence. Were we here 10 years ago, we would have been talking about mobile technology. 10 years before that, the internet, before that, other things. And I think it's really important to kind of have that moment of saying there are a whole lot of the pieces of the conversation we're having now that would be familiar to lots of people in the audience. We've had some of these conversations before about, does this technology reproduce certain kinds of inequity? Does this technology have haves and have-nots? And for me, one of the things that's really striking is those kind of notions about what technologies might support and who might be the winners and the losers stretches back to the first global technologies, things like, well, the telegraph in the 1850s and 1860s, right, where the proponents of that technology, which had many of the same components of today, big tech companies investing in technological breakthroughs. They just happen to be Western Union, not Google. Governments trying to work out how to connect things and what it meant to connect them and what the standards should be. Fights over who got to drop cables in the ocean. And a series of individuals, including people like, Samuel Morse in the US and a man named Charles Todd in Australia. And in those days, the 1850s and 60s, I don't think the people that were building global connecting technologies fully understood what the consequences would be. They knew they were part of empire. They understood they were playing out, those kind of power games. But I'm not sure they understood that those technologies were going to create inequities around gender, around race, around ethnicity, class, location, caste. But in 2023, you'd be naive if you didn't already anticipate that might be a consequence. And so when we ask who should be anticipating it, I mean, for me, the answer is everyone. So we should be, as citizens, and I want to be really clear here, whilst many companies have consumers, globally we also have citizens, and those aren't quite interchangeable terms. So as citizens, we should be able to say, here's how we want to show up in this new world. And we should have organisations that are willing to fight for us in those positions. So citizens should get to have a point of view about this. Governments, clearly. Transnational organisations, absolutely. Social institutions beyond transnational organisations, to those two. And then corporations of multiple constituencies. The problem becomes, where on earth is that conversation or set of conversations going to happen? And how do you do it when, in fact, you can say artificial intelligence, and gosh, that sounds so neat and tidy. But lurking underneath artificial intelligence, it's not actually a technology. Artificial intelligence is everything from a data set to an algorithm to possibly a statistical model to a server farm, a network, a connectivity grid. If we want to regulate AI, we're actually going to have to think about what the regulatory framework might look like for every one of those pieces. And every one of those pieces will have a different point to it. And then I guess last but by no means least, because I'm fairly certain my job here is to make things more complicated, not less complicated. So once you've lined up all those people, citizens, consumers, governments, transnational organisations, social and civic institutions, and others, I think there are the pieces that don't yet have a voice in that conversation. So how is it when we talk about the future of technology that we want to account for the environment and sustainability? We know that it's one thing to talk about data, but all that data lives somewhere, and that somewhere has to be powered and cooled, and all of that comes from somewhere else. So there's a bit about what are the pieces of the puzzle that we know are necessary to the future that don't necessarily have a voice in these conversations, and how would we start to put that there too?
Yeah, Kent, do you want to pick up on that?
No, very, very much so. I mean, I share this vision. I think it has to be a multi-stakeholder conversation. Our mission statement is to organize the world's information, making it universally accessible and useful. And that calls you to the notion of how do you use tools like AI to do more, to do it better, and to do it for everyone. And it's easy to forget that when you're in an individual lab. But the benefits of science, we're saying, pushing back the frontiers of science, this notion of doing science at digital speed is really profound and we think potentially life-changing for people everywhere. So the question that we pose for ourselves is, can you be bold and responsible? Can you create these new tools, but do it in a way with frameworks and guardrails and thinking through the implications for people around the world, and to make sure we're doing it in partnership with governments, as we work with the government of Ukraine and governments around the world who are starting to figure out how to regulate these new tools and technologies.
So I actually wanted to ask you, Deputy Prime Minister, a little bit about generative AI. Is obviously something we're already talking about it. I didn't think we'd get to it this quickly, but we're talking about it. It's something that's, it's in the U.S. There's a lot of discussion around it, around plagiarism, copywriting, but there's obviously national security implications too in terms of misinformation. And so I'm wondering how concerned you are about deep fakes and artificially generated materials impacting Ukraine's national security when misinformation is such a serious crisis. What are you seeing today?
Yes, indeed. We saw a lot of Russian propaganda. We saw a lot of deep fakes. We saw how Russia has been using the instruments of propaganda and how they learned to work with that. Naturally, what helped us was sanctions of tech companies that were imposed on Russia. And of course, what helps is the digital education, because we're teaching Ukrainians of digital literacy so they could differentiate true information from the fake one, so they could analyze the information. And I think that the support of the democratic world, of independent media that spread information, they send a very powerful communication signal to Ukrainian independent media. They form a field of independent information that Ukrainians would not fall for fakes. Naturally, by developing the digital state, an important component of that is a digital signature. And of course, we've been looking for solutions, how to solve this issue. And we started using a neural network that checks your face with biometrics of your photograph in the demographic register. And then we saw, when we started it, and we gave it an opportunity to generate a signature, we realized there would be a certain risk of deep fakes. Therefore, we started to introduce new additional instruments to combat that. As it stands today, the fraud or mistakes that may be, they're 0%. We don't have any abuse of electronic signature. What I'm trying to say here is now it's a war of technologies. When a revolutionary technology is launched, a new technology also appears that wants to harm this new technology. And when we talk about the states, it's always been the case. Then we think about it and bring together world companies thinking and finding a solution, trying to find a solution how to improve from the security point of view. So the approach, security by design, is a very important one for us because there is an opportunity to create an architecture of all products from the get-go, taking into account all risks and opportunities and possibilities that exist in the world. So there is a certain methodology and technique how to work with a field full of fakes, and there are certain approaches in technological wars, what one should do with when there's a counteraction to the technologies that you launch. And that's normal for all of us today. It's a reality of ours today. In democratic societies, when they generate products and services that compete among themselves. And there's always a set of people who want to use these technologies somehow to harm negatively.
I was actually agreeing and thinking to myself, and as a result of that, it's always really interesting where the legal controls come from. So, we know that even as we're having conversations about deep fakes and their consequences for national security, we're also having them in terms of copyright. And how is it that we start to say and protect certain kinds of data sets? So, in the last 2 weeks in the United States, multiple lawsuits emergent about who gets to control certain kinds of images, what it means to think about, I was the creator of this, but now it is priming a data set. And it's always sort of ironic and interesting for me, Deputy Prime Minister, that occasionally what we end up having is the laws that manage new technologies are sometimes ones that developed for much older technologies, so that, it becomes places where we say, well, here's a legal framework that's actually unexpectedly extensible here.
Yeah, or not.
Indeed, well, that's also the case.
And I think one of the things that we're facing now is this idea that tech policy, tech governance, tech regulation is like woefully inadequate in dealing with the new technologies that are emerging at such a pace. I was really interested when you talk about tech war as well, because it is a tech war, and we're seeing it play out in Ukraine right now. I think for us as civil society, we see the fallout of technology on the front lines all the time. It's a new evolution, I think, for the world now to be able to see that this is a battle of technologies, and it's not just about product or about market share. It's actually about the existential, the existence or not of a state, and it forms the basis of not just societal engagement, but actually geopolitics in a way that's, at this point ungovernable. I think our international institutions and our regulatory bodies are really freaking out, and to use a
technical term.
It's a freak out, and you can see it here. You've mentioned generative AI, and the sort of the consequences of that. There is going to be a lot of work for the lawyers, but I think a lot of work for us in civil society as well to grapple with this.
And I think it's important not to give up hope, if I can jump in. There are efforts to try and have multilateral, bilateral frameworks, the EU-US data security framework that's moving forward, the cross-border privacy rules, civil society, the Global Internet Forum to counter terrorism. So you see efforts to try and create a more interoperable global regulatory approach, which I think is
it's good. I think it's definitely some good intent, but often as civil society, to be frank, we don't find ourselves with a seat at the table. The impact is upon the users. We, for example, with the metaverse, the so-called metaverse, we as civil society have been talking about how do we actually grapple with this? What are the consequences of discrimination in terms of content moderation, in terms of data collection, in terms of the possibility of surveillance? And yet it is often the companies and the governments that are making decisions in boardrooms or in unattainable forums. I think it's absolutely essential for us to be at the table, to be able to not just be there for window dressing, but I think we just get better policy and better practice with us at the table.
I actually wanted to ask you again, Deputy Prime Minister. You've asked, in this idea of tech war, you've asked U.S. big tech firms to cut ties with Russia, and I'm curious, sort of how do you feel that it's going, and what are you asking from them there?
Yes, we ask all tech companies to stop working with Russia, because today, as a matter of fact, the tech companies create the biggest added value, and they capitalize very quickly. If we look at how much Tesla costs, and the biggest industrial company of Gazprom of Russian Federation, there will be 8 times difference of Tesla values. And Tesla is one of the US companies. There are numerous companies in the US who are valued at hundreds of billions or tens of billions of dollars. Our first task was to throw Russia back to many years ago, so they wouldn't be using technologies now during the war. A very simple example. For example, we take a product that is used to, face recognition product, to find and identify the bodies of killed Russian soldiers. And we would find then their relatives and inform their families. Or we use AI of some companies to target the drones in a more precise manner to hit the tanks. Or we use solutions of cloud companies to move all our data to the cloud and to protect them from the missiles. And that actually protects our digital state, helps us on the front line, on the battlefield. That helps us to defeat the Russian tanks. It helps us to launch services for the citizens. Technologies help us to survive and fight. And we do not want these technologies of the entire democratic world would help Russia to fight Ukraine. And therefore, we want to throw Russia back in time. When Visa and MasterCard leave the Russian market, Adobe Photoshop or Figma leave the market, that means designers and engineers cannot even pay for their service. It's inconvenient. Technologies have a difficulty being developed when there's no freedom of products, no freedom at all. Therefore, they move. A lot of IT experts in creative industry creators left Russia. When they left Russia, they can't develop caliber missiles that fly into Ukraine and kill our people. It's important that digital blockade should happen, that tech companies leave Russia. by doing so, they throw Russia back many years into the past. And it will be difficult then for the Russians to fight for their technological future. At the same time, these companies help us to be more agile, more convenient, more effective, and win.
Kent, this is your territory. How do how, I guess broadly speaking, sort of how do how does your business evolve to sort of in different regions in order to ensure you're living up to the promises of not doing evil and big tech more generally?
As the Deputy Prime Minister knows, we were one of the earliest companies to stop doing business in Russia. We were honored to actually receive one of the peace prizes that the government awarded from the minister. We do virtually no business in Russia, except I think it's important to say, we still have YouTube that is available going into Russia, and it's become a channel for a number of positive ways of telling the story of what's really happening, the human rights abuses in Bucha and other kinds of stories of what's really happening on the front line. We are simultaneously taking down disinformation and propaganda around the world. We have removed thousands of channels from Russia and tens of thousands of videos that were misinformation, disinformation, because we are trying to uphold high standards of quality, authoritative, responsible, and reliable information. So there's this important balance to strike. We want to work closely with the government, but we also want to make sure that the truth is being told.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, it's so fascinating now to see the role of the tech company in war, and to see it so plainly and also so proudly as well. It raises so many questions, I think, in terms of private sector engagement in what has been largely a state-to-state conflict, and what are the decisions that the tech companies are making and how they make them. In this instance, it's obviously clear that Russia is engaged in an illegal invasion of a democratic state, and pretty much all of the Western tech companies have moved to the side of Ukraine, and admirably and appropriately. But what happens when it's not so clear and there are many conflicts that are happening around the world? What happens when Twitter's on one side of the battle and Google's on the other side? And I think it's really important that there's a set of principles and some norms that tech companies can use to decide, like, how do they get involved, when do they get involved, and perhaps most importantly, or equally importantly, when do they disengage? I just want to pick up on the sanctions thing as well, or the digital blockade that the Deputy Prime Minister mentioned. It's obviously extremely important that we, as democratic states and as civil society, that we think how to empower the Ukrainian government. I think it's also important to think about the civilians and civil society, the anti-war movement, the telling of information from the front line within Russia to be able to get some of those stories within the community, within the Russian population, because otherwise all they're going to get and all they are receiving is the stories of Putin. I think it's essential that, and that's why there's been some of the carve-outs from the US government and the European Union to allow certain retail tech to still be available to Russians. I know it's a little bit controversial, but I think that Putin is very clear. He wants to disaggregate the Russian internet from the world internet. And in this extraction, we also, in a way, do some of Putin's bidding for him, which I think in the long term would be dangerous. We don't want a splinter net. We want one global network. Of course, I understand, Deputy Prime Minister, the imperative and the need. Just to think about it in some broader terms.
I want to go to the audience for some questions in just a minute. So get your questions ready, and if you do have a question, please stand up, and there will be a mic that comes around for you. Brett, I also had another question for you, which is, this is a sort of changing gears a little bit around the pandemic. It obviously created urgent need for tools for countries to consider investments in biotech. We haven't talked about biotech as a national security tool, but these things are hard to anticipate and plan for. And so when we think about rolling out programs that promote public health, such as vaccines, without invading people's privacy. So in the US, there were HIPAA laws, right, that made it difficult for the US to track who was vaccinated. But in places like China, the process was quite invasive, to the point where people actually just, rebel will be a strong word, but, chose not to partake. So what's the right balance in something like that?
To follow up with an easy question. Well, I think one of the interesting things that happened with the pandemic is that, in the first year of the pandemic, 800 million people joined the internet for the first time. So that was like a great evolution, a great development. It recognized the importance of digitalization, the importance of how being connected to the internet is pretty much in the pandemic the main pathway to achieving you being able to enjoy your human rights, to be able to express, opine, to have healthcare, to have education, etc. To many school kids around the world, that was their entry point through the internet. Obviously, like, health data has become extremely important. I don't think that the proper regulatory frameworks that were in place in my country, Australia. My health record was just a disaster because there was just data that had been collected, the absence of proper data protection laws. The US still has no proper data protection framework, and yet there are contact tracing apps, etc. So, it's been very, very challenging. Obviously, the right to health is a human right, and so we do need to balance that with the right to privacy and the right to freedom of movement and association, etc. It's definitely very challenging. I think that they shouldn't be those rights should not be pitted against each other, and there are some regulatory and explanatory frameworks to help that happen.
What do you think about that? You see, I have a great line to you. You can see when your brain's going.
Oh, look, I think one of the places we find ourselves really challenged when we start to talk about personal data and data about our person is it is a place where Brett's absolutely right. The regulatory frameworks are stuck, not even 10 years ago, but with a very different notion about privacy, right? Where it was about individual data attributes. So my gender, my age, my healthcare, my religion were things that were individually protected in multiple states, in multiple countries. But we've gotten to a point where two things have happened. One, it's less about the individual data points, but more about what happens when you put them together. So it's, yes, it's about do we know how old Brett is and where he's from, but it's equally about what do we know about Brett in terms of his taste, his habits, his behaviours, and thinking how we protect that becomes quite complicated. And then the second piece is we're also surrounded by technology that knows an inordinate about enough information about us, but doesn't necessarily know what to do with that. So whether you've got a Fitbit or a smart tracker, or you have a smart electrical grid box in your house, which knows how warm you like to be and whether you have other people in your house, that it knows, in fact, extraordinarily personal things about you, but we don't know how to think about that yet as personal data. And so I look at all of that and say, we have regulatory challenges about that, and at the moment, not only do we not know how to sort of conceptualise that, but we also like to imagine that it's about individuals, whereas we also know that there are lots of groups around the world where individual data is less important than the collective. So how do we start to think about legislation in places where the individual isn't the smallest unit of social meaning, but it's the group, the clan, the tribe? There's multiple other ways of thinking about this stuff. And so for me, I'm often really struck by how these conversations reinforce certain ideas about what a data set looks like and what someone should be concerned about it. And then I look at some of the places that I think actually have gotten it right. So our colleagues in New Zealand, when they developed their algorithmic charter, made a first attempt to actually have a conversation intra-government, not even between governments, of basically saying, what sorts of information should we keep? How do we think about our First Nations people? So what does it mean to have Maori data, and how do the Maori want to think about self-determination of their own data inside a large nation state? And so for me, yes, human rights, yes, the legal framework, but yes, we also have to imagine that it is more complicated than it has ever been, and that there are emergent categories of things that can violate your privacy that you didn't even know new things about you.
Right.
Not to make you suddenly concerned about your electrical meter.
So, okay, let's go to the audience to see if there are any questions. If you do have a question, raise your hand. We'll get a mic around. And I just ask that you keep your question somewhat brief so that we can move on to others too, so everybody has a chance. So there's one over here.
Yeah, I know. I was with them.
Go ahead. If you could stand up, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Brett McDowell with the Hedera Public Blockchain Network. My question is for Deputy Prime Minister. In 2022, there were a lot of bad outcomes in the blockchain industry. And this is a forum where technology and policymakers come together. And there's a strong sentiment among policymakers to react to the bad outcomes by certain elements in 2022. Do you have any position on the right way for government to interact, especially in the public blockchain space, otherwise known as crypto, and what you'd hope to see other policymakers do in regard to regulation and constraining while also supporting that industry?
Да. Да.
Well, thank you very much for your question. In Ukraine, we passed the draft law about virtual assets, and partly to answer the questions that you've just mentioned. I believe that all governments, they can't ignore the development of virtual assets or blockchain technologies. For example, we've tested already the electronic hryvnia using blockchain in Ukraine. I will soon start getting my salary in e-hryvnia as a test pilot of this model. Yes, the year was difficult both for virtual assets based on the blockchain technology, but it's impossible to ignore this big elephant in the room. And we have to use it to develop the digital economy. Today, a lot has been said about the fact that the policies that have been formulated are lagging behind the technological progress. And we see that the future of the governments is the governments who are going to succeed are those governments who are going to be agile and make quick decisions. Not a single government can use an agile approach, but it's not only about the technological companies. Agile approach is for any project because consumer behavior is changing. There are a lot of challenges appearing. One has to quickly test the products, launch them, improve them. Therefore, either the governments are going to work in an agile fashion, adapt the policy, change policy. It's okay to change policy several times, or they're going to lag behind badly. And then there will be virtual taxation and legal regimes that will be created. Companies will be incorporated there. For example, that's what the Arab Emirates are doing that. And a lot of companies are moving this. Portugal was working in this direction, working with mining and virtual assets, and they will be fighting and competing for the capital, fast-moving capital. Because now, in a couple of clicks, one can become a financial economic resident of any country. Companies will migrate and choose the best residence jurisdiction for them. It seems to me, if we're talking about virtual assets, blockchain, this is number one area that is going to quickly change the jurisdictions in order to develop quickly. Therefore, it's necessary to learn, to study the policies in various countries. The United States are now formulating policies actively in this space. The European Union is working actively on that. We have to look all of that, analyze it, and bring experts, business experts, analyze risks to improve them so we could bring more money into the country that is going to be more agile and quick. So therefore, it's also a fight of battle between legislative initiative for the money and for the people who work in this direction. Therefore, we support that, and I'm sure and convinced that in the nearest future will be one of the best jurisdictions. I will invite you to incorporate in Ukraine. Кент, ви хочете сказати на цю тему щось? Кен. Так. Я не буду говорити. Вибачте,
my Ukrainian is a little weak. I'm working. So we have not been deeply involved in the blockchain side, but stepping back to the minister's broader point about how we need to have mobile, nimble governments to address some of these challenges, I think there's no alternative to this. Many of the frameworks we have, as we were saying earlier, evolved in the 1800s and have been evolved, and that's a natural and appropriate thing. You build and you learn. But when you have step change innovations, I think you need to have step changes in governance as well. New kinds of frameworks that address these new challenges. We had our protein folding exercise where AlphaGo folded 200 million proteins around the world. Your body is made up of proteins. It used to be that it would take a PhD student their entire PhD to fold a single protein. We folded 200 million of them in a year. That's 1 billion hours of PhD effort that can now be used in other areas. How do governments think about those new opportunities? Those are new tools that they've never had before. But again, how do we make sure we have governance to make sure they're not being abused?
Any other questions from the audience? Going once, going twice? Okay, I have a final question then for everyone on stage. We were talking about this backstage a little bit. I'm hoping each of you could give us something that you're optimistic about. I want to end on something positive. let's keep it to the realm of technology, something that you're optimistic about. And I guess also a big question that you would ask everyone in this audience and everyone watching online to keep in mind. It's something for them to think about in this context. So maybe I will start on the end with Genevieve.
Excellent. A thing I'm optimistic about. So Brett and I both come from Australia, which is, not a thing to be optimistic about right now, because going back there is going to take me all the hours that I have left in my life. But I'm lucky enough to work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, where I do in Canberra, Australia. And I'm lucky enough to have colleagues who have been creating this project, which is the most extraordinary art thing I've ever seen. And it took the data of a football player by the name of Adam Goods, so an Aboriginal football player. It took the data of his body on the playing field and married it with a volumetric capture of the tree under which his family has lived for 500 years, put them together as a digital display, as a visualization, and animated it using a neural network trained on the song lines of his people in 2 different languages to make it move. And you can find it on the web, trackerdataproject.com.au. And it was one of the first times I saw someone taking digital technology, AI, and a completely different knowledge base to produce something extraordinary and beautiful. And so for me, I looked at that and I said, we spend a lot of time talking about AI in the context of efficiencies and productivities and labor. And I want to keep remembering that we can also talk about technology in terms of creating splendor and beauty and wonder and opening up possibilities that don't otherwise exist. So I guess if that's my kind of contribution of a beautiful thing, or an unexpected thing, and a thing that, also talked about what it meant to be Aboriginal in a football game, which is complicated in Australia, what it meant to be Aboriginal in Australia, which is also complicated, but turning all of that complexity and, Brett's kind of language of surveillance into something that also spoke about a place and a moment in time. If that's the kind of the beautiful thing, I think for me, the thing I wish everyone would keep in mind is that all of these technologies also have the possibility of creating new things. And I tend to think that all of us here have this sort of dual responsibility, right? We need to be constantly telling stories about a future that's more optimistic, more sustainable, more just, more fair than the present in which we find ourselves. And then we need to be actively disrupting the present to make those things more than just stories. So there's work for all of us.
Great. How about, you want to go next, Deputy Prime Minister? I'm going to go out of order. I'm going to go skip around.
My best hope for technologies in nearest future is how technologies are going to help us be victorious over Putin in Russia and stop war. For us, technologies is an opportunity, and we're going to use them to the maximum. As far as the question that we need to find answers to is how to make technologies more accessible for people around the world and how we can integrate them into the education process more. It seems to me all our problems in the world stem from bad education, from incorrect education trajectory, from bad socialization, and therefore dictators emerge who want to dominate, and therefore people emerge who can't earn their living and they rob, etc., etc. So technologies, we need to clone other planets to develop further. We need to have more countries to deal with space exploration, so we'd have a progress, so we could move to other planets quicker and faster, so we could protect the humankind. But in order for that, we need more educated humankind. We should put an end to the wars. We need to put an end to epidemics and disasters. So therefore, education is essential and important. We need to deal more with the integration of technologies into the education around the world. That's my internal feeling that I have.
Ken, how about you?
In the midst of all our challenges, it's easy to lose track of how much progress we've made. 1 billion people have come out of extreme poverty in the last 20 years. That is unprecedented in the history of mankind. People say that challenges are anecdotal and progress is statistical, and the human mind is much better at grappling with stories than it is with numbers. But we can be proud that that's a lot more babies living and growing and succeeding in life. And that's technology, and that's good governance, and the like. So you asked us for our questions. The questions I would pose for every company and every country is, how do we take advantage of this? What is your digital strategy? And what is our digital strategy collectively to make the most of these opportunities?
All right, final word to Brett.
Thank you. I mean, I am quite inspired actually to hear this. You know, I think there was a period of tech utopianism, which was, you know, exciting. And then there's been this long period now, I'd say for at least 10 years of like tech lash and tech doom. To sort of think now with like new tech, there's definitely been a jump in technology, even like the last 12 months, the last 6 months, maybe even the last week, it feels like there's something big happening. And to use those technologies in a way to actually disrupt some of the problems that we've seen in the previous generation of technologies. And one of the things that I'm really excited about is actually the growth and the diversity of the digital rights movement around the world. Every country has this amazing growth of new organizations that understand the tech world, digital natives that understand AI and understand quantum, that are helping to actually shape those technologies. We're under a lot of stress as civil society. We're facing fake news laws that are bad. We're facing cybercrime laws. But there's this amazing possibility of when civilians come together and actually get to shape the technology and the framework around it. And the question that I would pose to all the regulators, the governments, the coders is, again, which to my first point, which is the human rights framework is there. Assessments against human rights in the terms of collection of data minimization, like, you know, collect just the data that you need, not the data that you can. You know, questions like that I think are absolutely important, making sure that we don't replicate some of the biases and the discriminations and the exclusion that we have with the current round of technology. So.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. Thank you to everyone in the audience and to everyone watching online. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.